Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Runeterra Report, Mastering Runeterra's weekly podcast, filling you in on everything you'll need to know for the upcoming week of Runeterra at a breakneck pace. I'm your host, DarwinTheory, NA Masters player and two-time Seasonals attendee, here to guide you through the meta for the week of January 16th, 2022. Without any further ado, let's dive right in and explore what you'll have to keep an eye on for this week of Runeterra. And just as we saw last week, Jinx Lulu is looking like a definitive force in the meta. With Aatrox definitively nerfed out of Tier 1, the deck has far surpassed the limits it was facing before the patch when Big Red was keeping it down. Seemingly only losing out to a few of the most played decks while dominating the rest, Jinx Lulu is very likely the best option to climb with, as its early board control and tempo are almost impossible for most decks to contest. As with the last several weeks, my best suggestions for deck inclusions are Augmented Experimenter and Electro Harpoon. With that being said, we've also seen decent results from the inclusion of one or two Mystic Shots. I don't know if it provides exactly what the deck's game plan needs, it might be a little too slow, but the results don't lie. Try it out and see how you feel. For anyone who enjoys playing fast, board-based decks, Jinx Lulu is my best recommendation to pick up some LP on the way to Seasonals, and it'll be a major player on that tournament stage to be sure. A deck with a very high play rate and a very polarizing matchup spread is the Bash Bros, Tryndamere, Trundle, Feel the Rush. Their main claim to fame is the utter devastation they wreak upon Norra Veigar, a lopsided affair that the Yordles have little chance of winning. They do lose quite hard to several popular decks though, such as Jinx Lulu, Sunburn, Lurk, and the growing Taliyah Ziggs. Hapless Aristocrat, a vintage control deck pick, is performing quite well by stats in a limited size right now. I'd take this with a grain of salt, however, since Hapless was statistically the worst card in the archetype not too long ago. I do like this one-of inclusion of the box, however, and I'd recommend making space for that if you're able to spare a slot in your list. Your pocket meta has to be right for the Bash Bros to see maximum effectiveness, and you run the risk of some particularly unfavorable matchups, but I definitely see the value in throwing some 10-10s at face against some of the rising stars in the meta. These two are here to stay for the time being, and I'd recommend learning the deck if combo control is your style. And speaking of rising stars in the meta, we've seen a startling rise in popularity as of recent from an old fan favorite. Norra Veigar went from around 6th or 7th most played a week ago to the definitive number 3 option in the meta. This deck forms a meta triangle with Jinx Lulu and Feel the Rush, where it beats Jinx Lulu definitively, but it gets rolled by the Bash Bros. It also beats Sunburn, which has had a meteoric rise to the top in its own right recently. Most of the matchups are fairly neutral otherwise, except for this deck getting absolutely dominated by Sundisk. It's actually terrifying to think, by the way, that Sundisk farms a deck that's worth 6% of the meta, like this is a 65-35 matchup, and Sundisk still has a win rate that looks this bad. I'll be touching on that dumpster fire later in everyone's favorite segment, but back to the deck at hand. Norragar is still not quite solved, but some less common options that are theoretically quite strong include a 1 of Withering Wail, a 1 of Wallop, and 1 or 2 copies of Unspeakable Horror. This deck already has plenty of pings, but more never hurt. I actually really like this Proximity Puffcap inclusion as well, despite its low play rate. I normally don't talk about deck takes with stupid low play rates like this unless their win rates are ridiculous, but I do like the synergy here. 3 damage is a breakpoint that this deck can really struggle to reach without Darkness in hand, and Norra's portals make it very easy to proc this card's extra damage effect, and once it's triggered, it's an incredibly efficient removal. I'm quite a fan of Norra Veigar's place in the current meta, and as long as Taliyah Ziggs and Cold Cuts, that's Gwen Sejuani, don't get too much more popular, I think it's here to stay for a good while. If you want to talk about underdogs though, this is the defining underdog story of our current meta. Katarina Leona, also known as Sunburn, is an incredibly powerful and high-tempo aggro deck that went from a complete unknown to one of the best decks in the game throughout a short 1-week span. Still crushes all of its winning matchups with absolutely obscene win rates, like, guys, look at this if you're watching the video, oh my god. And it manages most of its losing matchups pretty reasonably as well. The only really scary deck among top-level meta-relevant options is Ekko Jinx, and I'll gladly take a piss matchup against that deck in exchange for the significant benefits that this archetype reaps. We finally have some more detailed stats with a higher play rate, and the creator of the archetype has made his thoughts clear on the best inclusions as well. Might and Solari Priestess are the way to go, folks. Priestess gives the deck some longevity in terms of resources, and Might can be a sneaky way to close out games, since the deck doesn't naturally run any units with evasive keywords. I also like Demolitionist, and Trinithan agrees. I would highly recommend checking out his recent guide for the deck on Mastering Runeterra if you're interested in playing it. He's a great guy, and as humble as he's trying to be about the whole thing, it's undeniable that he's created a new meta-defining powerhouse, if only by accident. The Katarina Leona matchup will be a key litmus test for any deck aspiring to be strong, as not many decks have the claim to fame of winning this matchup very decisively, and it grows more popular by the day. For what feels like the first time in forever, Red Gwen is not the most dominant Katarina archetype in the game. That goes to Sunburn. The Fallen Reckoner nerfs actually hit the deck pretty hard, and its abysmal matchups against Jinx Lulu and Sunburn are catching up to it. Taliyah Ziggs and Ekko Jinx, several decks that keep getting more popular by the day, also seem to be terrible matchups for Gwen and Katarina. I still like the Rune Squire inclusion from last week, but otherwise my recommendations staunchly remain the same as always. Mark of the Isles, Crimson Pigeon, Legion Rearguard. The strongest versions of Red Gwen are high-tempo, high-threat decks right now, and these cards are essential for that game plan. There aren't too many decisively winning matchups here, and the losing ones lose badly. But if you find yourself running into a lot of fringe archetypes, this deck still shines and dominates against many of the less common options due to its raw power and tempo. It has a place in the meta, but I wouldn't take it against many of the top dogs. And sneaking its way into the latter half of the report for what feels like the 100th week in a row, Plunder keeps on keeping on by beating some key players and limiting its losing matchups. Looks tough against Sunburn, and in particular Ekko Jinx and Gwen Sejuani, but it beats the rising Taliyah Ziggs, handles Lulu Jinx well enough, and absolutely obliterates Lurk. Battling Bjerg's performance seems to have slightly gone up in the last week, as is also the case with Three Sisters, and we're even seeing some presence from the old favorite Monster Harpoon. My best guess is that it's the deck's most effective answer for Jinx, and it does kill an unleveled Leona or snipe a Katarina in the Sunburn matchup as well. Try 2 copies if you haven't included them previously. It's a meta call option, but I think this meta does suit it well. In a sea of unfamiliar new faces, or old archetypes coming back with a vengeance, Plunder has been a beacon of consistency, and looks to remain that way as time goes forward. With each passing week, Ekko Jinx only seems to get better and more popular. It makes sense, too, considering that it actively crushes several of the best decks in the game, and it goes toe-to-toe with many others in barely losing matchups. While Legna's data is slightly more readable, and it would give me a clearer impression if it were available, seriously, I hate you, Bandwidth Goblin. What I can tell from Mastering Runeterra's matchup data here tells me this is actually probably an underplayed archetype. This matchup spread should theoretically make Ekko Jinx one of the best archetypes in the game, if not the sole best. Still a relatively tight deck list, but I want to see more of you running Forge Chief for its mana efficiency, and especially Rite of Negation. As this deck grows stronger and more popular, having a surprise counterspell available as protection will be critical to keep your champions safe and alive. It also helps that having only one copy often doesn't break your draw, especially since you can predict into it. If the Jinxless Ekko Zillion variant is just as viable as this one, I expect it'll become a major player alongside Lulu Jinx in the tournament scene. But don't sleep on the Zaunite duo. Arcane fans out there should be happy to pick up this deck and secure plenty of free LP, as soon as they can get past its punishing learning curve. Taliyah Ziggs Bandle City, a deck we haven't seen much of in a few months outside of Worlds, seems to have come back to some degree of relevance. I would personally say it's only for certain pocket metas though, since the deck's matchups are looking very one-sided, either wins or losses. Smashes Red Gwen, Norra, Sundisk, and Lurk, while comfortably beating the Bash Bros as well. With that being said, you really don't want to play this deck against either Jinx archetype. Plunder is generally a pretty upsetting matchup, and Sunburn is more even but still not good. Other Noxus aggro archetypes also seem to consistently ream the Landmark duo, which lines up with their history anyways. Any Shurima Landmark deck should be featuring the Doob Lord. Rockbear Shepherd is unsurprisingly one of the best performing cards in the archetype. Herald of the Magus and the Arsenal are also critical pieces to close out games, and I'm of the opinion that you always want to have them available, especially since this deck should be aiming to target slower control decks. I actually like more than one copy of each, but that's just me. Reliquary versions of the deck are performing quite terribly by comparison after the card was nerfed, so I would recommend sticking to the more traditional Taliyah Ziggs game plan. If you're really sick of those nasty control decks ruining your fun, give this demolishing duo a try. You just might be surprised by how explosive your combo game can get. A weirdo niche pick with a crazy win rate and a good-looking matchup spread, I'd keep my eye on Gwen Sejuani or Cold Cuts for the time being. It's a deck that really likes certain popular matchups. Norra, Sundisk, Plunder, and Lurk are all great. Many other top dogs are good or even, and the only real catastrophe here among great decks is Sunburn. You also lose to ephemerals, but I've made my opinion on that archetype very clear, and I don't think that it's a huge knock against these femme fatales to lose that matchup. Hilariously, Cold Cuts seems to really like Bone Club. As a club enjoyer myself, this brings me intense joy. Jokes aside, the deck list seems pretty tight, and there aren't too many other strong inclusions that aren't already widely played. I do like this Spirits Unleashed option, but I don't have enough personal experience on the archetype to say for sure whether it's legitimate. Cold Cuts is another one of those specific meta calls, but I think it's great when Plunder, Disc, Lurk, and Norra are coming up super often. Just try to avoid playing it when you're constantly queuing into Sunburn or other Noxus aggro options. That gets ugly real quick. While Swain TF was originally proposed as an Aatrox counter towards the end of that meta, the Grand General and his old pirate friend don't seem to mind this new field one bit. As I've said previously though, this deck takes polarizing to a whole new level. You can easily sack tons of LP on this list if your pocket meta isn't quite right for it. Play it against Jinx Lulu, Lurk, Katarina archetypes, Noxus aggro, and ephemerals, and pray to God that you avoid Field Rush, Disc, Plunder, Taliyah Ziggs, Cold Cuts, or any of these other fringe options that just mess you up. We're seeing even stronger results from that Legionary Charge tech from last week, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm still in love with it. Draw those win cons, baby. As I said last week, Piltover Castaway and Coral Creatures are other great options that give you back some mana to enable your damaging spells, and Ruined Reckoner is fantastic with a leveled Swain. I do like Crusty Codger as well, as a way to level up your Swain a little bit quicker. It's usually inferior to Watchful Idol on turn 1, but having a few copies of the Codger as an alternative backup in case you don't draw your Idol can be nice to get you on the board early while progressing your Swain. Get a feel for your pocket meta before locking this in, because on ladder it's one of the riskiest options available. Despite that, it has the potential for some absolutely nuts LP gains, and I expect it to be one of the strongest tournament players in certain targeting lineups. While I'm still not super high on Noxus aggros in general, with the obvious exception of Sunburn, I do think Pirates has set itself apart from the bunch as the definitive strongest option available. It's probably just better than Discard or Ginny. Still gets smoked by Lulu Jinx, Sunburn, and Norra, and especially run over by Ekko Jinx, but steals away matchups against some of the slightly less popular contenders at alarming win rates. Ginny and Discard are also popular, but just perform worse in almost every way. In minuscule sizes, we're seeing some success from Hired Gun. I don't know if that'll last. Double Up and Island Navigator are still very strong options, in addition to the now classic Pigeon Feast pairing that carries every Noxus aggro deck. Guys, I'm gonna be level with you. I'm a bit emotionally traumatized by this Buru Cultist at this point. It's been 3 weeks. I can't figure out how or why it's strong in this archetype. I can't find any specific lists that have it online. I don't know where the archetype gets its weapons since that Hookmaster nerf forever ago. I implore you guys, please, if you know, tell me what's up with this. Shoot me a message on Discord, because I have a burning curiosity and I can't figure out what makes Buru Cultist good in Pirate aggro. The stats say nothing of use. Anyways, very good to play into weaker options or as a specific counter to Field of Rush or Red Gwen. A bit lower on my list because 3 of its best matchups are against decks that I find relatively weak, as we're about to cover in the Radioactive Hazard Pile. Everyone's favorite segment for the negative Nancys out there is back, and I'm excited to put some of my least favorite archetypes on blast. Lurk is still performing quite underwhelmingly, and it's no longer at the play rate level where I feel I have to keep it out of the RHP, so it's back in here. It's a mid-range slayer and a meta with relatively little mid-range, and I just can't get behind it. You can still totally play it up to Masters, and dedicated players can make it work in Masters too, but I'm not a fan. You have stronger options. The same goes for Ephemerals and Sundisk. Just as I was considering recently that I may have been too harsh on Ephemerals last week, it further tanks its win rate and continues to really make me quite sad. All 3 of these decks give you so much dopamine, but they just don't win games. Continue to not play Rise as we slowly but surely figure out how on earth to get him anywhere near positive win rate territory. The same goes for basically every Kale archetype. Gwen Aurelia continues to be stupidly mediocre at best, and I just can't put it out there over other options. Bandlebar is probably dead now, and it should stay that way for the time being. Deep seems to be seeing a bit of a resurgence, but the stats and matchups just don't back it up. Save your LP and avoid that combo for the time being. Several other old heads, like traditional Senna Darkness, Katarina Yasuo, and Slay Midrange seem to be coming back. I would recommend they head back to the old folks' home in time for the bingo game to start, because the latter seems to be a pretty hostile environment for them for the time being. Well, everyone, that'll be just about everything for this week's Runeterra report here on Mastering Runeterra. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening until the end. If you have any questions or concerns about the podcast, please feel free to hit me up through the Mastering Runeterra Discord server or personally at DarwinTheory9305. And if you know anything about the Buru cultist in Pirate Aggro, please hit me up at DarwinTheory9305. Massive shoutouts to MasteringRuneterra.com for making this happen, as well as every individual affiliated with the site who helped me piece together the data that I needed for this podcast. Other special shoutouts go to the folks behind LOR.GG, as well as Legna's website for matchup data, although that damn bandwidth goblin is back, and I want my graphs back, please. I love you, Legna. Your site's awesome. I can't wait for it to refresh. Gathering data isn't easy, but when I can cross-reference with such reliable sources, it's a massive help to make sure that I know what I'm talking about is correct. The folks at Mastering Runeterra post quite often, so if you aren't already a regular, I'd highly recommend you swing by and see what's in store. We've got meta tier lists, matchup spreads, and a best of 3 ban helper for you tournament players out there, all updated every few hours to ensure that we have the best data out there. We also have articles posted by top players who know their stuff nearly every single day, so you'll be sure to find something you like no matter where you look. This has been Darwin Theory, and on behalf of everyone at Mastering Runeterra, I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in and wish you all a successful week of laddering. I hope to see you back next week, where we'll be one step closer to regaining our gorgeous graphs from our good friend Legna's website, so we can see in full definition just how horrible Sundisk is. Happy climbing!